Yo, Steam just added a warning for abandoned games, but this begs the question, if you know that an early access game hasn't been updated for 8 years, why are you still selling it? Like, could you imagine walking into a Walmart and seeing a limited time sale for 2013 calendars? Of course you're gonna buy it because it's on sale, but should Walmart really be selling it? I just made a video about the Steam update, and judging by the comments, y'all have some strong opinions on this. You really want Steam to do something about the abandonware problem. They're probably not going to, and I'm here to make a video invalidating your feelings. No, I'm just kidding. The trend of dying games and abandoned games sucks for everyone, but Steam's approach to it seems to be intentional, and that might not be a bad thing. Now, before you get your torches and your pitchforks, let me explain Steam's take on this. I read several of Steam's past statements, their terms of service, as well as guidelines for the developers on the platform. And I gotta say, this is the first time I've ever read, like, terms of service, and who would have thought? Terms of service are born. But after reading it did sort of paint a clear picture of Steam's philosophy. I think it's important to note that just because Valve is a privately owned company doesn't mean they don't have stakeholders. So they still need to balance the interests of their gamers, as well as their developers, and their own interests. For the most part, I think that Valve does a really good job at this. But this also means that every move that Steam makes isn't going to be one for one the best thing for the gamer. Because the best thing for the gamer is just give us all games for free. But obviously they can't do that. When reading through the rules and guidelines, there's one big thing that stood out to me, and because I don't typically read through rules and guidelines, I don't know if it's standard or if this is intentional. The section on the actual rules didn't say what you can't post on Steam, it said what you shouldn't post on Steam. And simply to keep these guidelines in mind when choosing whether to proceed with distribution. And I think at face value, I would have taken that as a hard set of rules until I discovered this 2018 post from Steam. And it kind of laid out their philosophy in more detail. It's called Who Gets to Be on the Steam Store. Pretty on the nose, but alright, we'll see what they had to say. This blog was written as a response to controversial content in games, but it really thoroughly lays out their philosophy for putting any game on Steam, and so it's very relevant to this conversation. In fact, they address this directly. They say there are controversial topics that are particular to games, like what even constitutes a game, or what level of quality is appropriate before something can be released. And so Steam knows this is an issue. It's always been an issue since I was in diapers back in 2018. And so most of the article, they're talking about how they struggled to determine what should or should not be allowed on the Steam store. But they finally arrived at a pretty clear decision. They say, and I quote, "We've decided that the right approach is to allow everything onto the Steam store, except for things that we've decided are illegal or straight up trolling." So if a game is in fact legal and not straight up trolling, then it can be on the Steam store. Pretty cut and dry. How you feel about that is gonna vary from person to person depending on how you feel about content moderation. But what they highlighted as their focus is what really brings Steam's philosophy together. They said our role should be to provide systems and tools to support your efforts to make these choices for yourself. So this recent Steam update really goes in line with that philosophy. They're not going to remove the game just because it's abandoned, they're just going to give players the information that they need to make an informed purchasing decision. And good on them. Content moderation is difficult. I mean, it can change a person. Look at the Zuck. But Steam's stance on it is pretty clear. They want to give players the freedom and information to make the right decision. They also want to give devs similar levels of freedom. That means not weighing in on whether a game is dead or abandoned or what constitutes finished. So Steam's not going to be removing any abandoned games on it anytime soon, but that's because of the philosophy that we've grown to love. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's any fix for the abandonware problem. But it's probably going to start with understanding why so many games get abandoned in the first place. I think the large majority of devs are building their games with the intention to finish. Call me an optimist. Like, I don't think there's many devs setting out to halfway build a buggy roguelike. Maybe I just see the world through rose-colored glasses. And if they are, like, my guy, there's way easier scams than building halfway through a game. Start a meme coin or something. I think that somewhere on the journey, devs go from like wide-eyed dreamers to abandoning ship. And if we can find that point, that proverbial iceberg, then there's gotta be some way we can navigate around it. In my mind, there's two different types of dead games. There's ghost towns and there's gutter balls. Ghost towns are those online games that were popular at one point, but now the devs don't think they're popular enough to be able to justify keeping them online. And like, honestly, that's a situation for a whole different video. This video is gonna be talking about like the gutter ball situations where they, they start with hope, but they just don't quite meet the finish line, and you turn around and see all your friends pointing and laughing at you. Ha ha ha. Ha. Yeah, so for the most part, the gutter games are early access games that just petered out at some point. When I think about it, there's really two huge issues that need to be solved in order for abandoned games to stop just popping up on Steam. The first, when you're working on a project with variable scope, it is very hard to see when that project is complete. Like, I make YouTube videos and I don't know when I should just be done editing. And this is like a 2-day process. I couldn't even imagine what it would be like to be in the trenches working on a game for literally years and then just like deciding it was done? Because there's no game that couldn't be improved, right? You could always do more, but how do you know when you don't need to? How do you know when it's done? That's like a really hard thing to see, especially when you're like in it. There's several early access games that are quote unquote abandoned, but they're basically finished products. The issue is that it's not a canvas, right? You can't step back and say,
okay, well, the whole thing is covered, so we should move on to the next canvas.
It's just not like that. And so that probably keeps a ton of early access games from ever actually getting the 1.0 version. And the second reason, and I think it's probably the most common reason that a game turns from an early access game to an abandoned game, is really the flaw in the early access system. The early access system will often just remove the benefit of releasing the game. It really front loads the reward. But there's something called the intention action gap, and that is like the dopamine release you get from just saying you're gonna do something versus actually accomplishing the thing. And this is the intention action gap on steroids. When you put out your unfinished game, you immediately get praise from people, you get reviews from people, you get money from people. And then after you've gotten all those things, what do you get from completing the game? Smaller versions of those things, right? Like Palworld, when it released, for example, I'm not saying it was a perfect game, but I had so much fun with it when in like the first 2 weeks that it was released in early access. I can't imagine that once Palworld has its full release, once it has its 1.0 version, the sales are gonna jump. Do they see another big financial benefit from working for several years to finish the game off? Sometimes they do. Baldur's Gate is a perfect example of a game that was in early access and then upon release saw giant benefits, but they handled early access much differently than most developers do. And then it seems like the only thing that's riding on the 1.0 version is your reputation. And if you're like a small dev with no reputation, and that's not a lot riding on it, right? I want to be clear, I don't fault developers for this. Given the situation, someone said,
hey Terrence, I want you to make a game for me. I'll give you $100,000 for starting and I'll give you $10 for finishing.
I don't know that I would finish the game. I think most developers go into early access believing 100% that they're going to finish. For this, I would actually love to hear from any developer that's been in a similar situation. Because in my mind, even developers that didn't end up finishing their game would like to see a system that would properly reward a finished game over an early access game, because that would give them more motivation to finish. And for me, that seems like it would benefit developers as well. If you're a developer that's been in this situation, let me know. And so the early access system does have merit in that it allows fans to support games that need support getting across the finish line, but it almost like incentivizes people to quit early. But Steam's hands-off philosophy doesn't really allow for a solution in this area, unless... This is a tricky situation because I actually love Steam's philosophy personally. I say that I subscribe to the gospel of gaming. So I don't want to ask them to change their philosophy or anything like that, but also I hate the idea of abandoned games in general. So while I know that a ton of people are saying just make the game free after like 2 years of not being worked on, take it off the store if it's not being worked on, that goes pretty hard against Steam's philosophy. But after reading through tons of the different ideas that people had in my last comment section, one stood out to me as like a plausible idea, and the second one came to me as not breaking Steam's philosophy, but maybe pushing up to the edge of it, edging Steam's philosophy. The first, and I think the most obvious one that people are requesting, is people are saying that early access has lost all meaning, the phrase early access. I think currently early access comes with an expectation of an eventual finished product, at least for casual gamers. And I'm not saying that's the right expectation, I'm just saying that's kind of how it feels right now. And that might be their fault, but it doesn't really matter because Steam's philosophy is giving those people the information to accurately make purchasing decisions on the platform. While I don't normally think semantic changes do anything, I think in this case it might. If you change early access to crowdfunded beta, that seems to have a much more accurate feel to it. Crowdfunded beta immediately gives you the perception of like, that game is still clearly in production, whereas early access is like, get a sneak peek before it releases, which is less and less often the case. I saw a lot of people saying that after a certain amount of time they should change it from early access to abandoned. Steam is not in the business of dictating whether a game is finished, abandoned, dead, or whatever, but they can effectively do something like that. Instead of changing the title from early access to abandoned, they can simply change that blue tag that says early access currently to bright red if there hasn't been an update in a year or 2 years or whatever. Something that contrasts against the page, because right now that little like, hey, this game hasn't been updated in 3 years or 8 years or whatever isn't super noticeable. There's still reviews, right? Like, there's still, generally if there's a dead game, there's horrible reviews. But I'm just saying, like, if you're gonna make the note, make the note. It doesn't do anything to stop front-loading all of the benefit of releasing a game into the early access portion. So I have a proposal. This is dangerous for me, I feel, because I have thought about this a bit, but I have not thought about it enough to like write a policy for it, okay? So it might not be the most well thought out plan. So going into early access, we already know there's two issues. One, scope creep, knowing what the finished game actually looks like, and two, disincentivizing the finished product. So one thing I'm proposing that could maybe solve both of those issues is a limit on early access copies sold. Now this sounds crazy. Even to me, I think this sounds crazy, but you know, tossing out ideas, right? There are obviously negatives to it. Not everyone can play the game that's in early access. And it might be a little hands-on for Steam's normal philosophy. For the people that have really been following the project, maybe they've crowdfunded the game a little bit already, this would be exciting for them to still try. They would still get the ability to play like the quote-unquote early access or the crowdfunded beta version of this game and support that developer and still be a part of that community. So it still opens up that option. But on the devs, at least on the surface, it seems like it has some solid benefits. It allows them to still fundraise, which is, you know, the main idea of what early access was for in the first place, right? But two, it sets a soft cap on the scope. Like if you're in early access, it's really easy to scope creep if money keeps flowing in. But if you know that this early access will bring in this much money, then your scope can't exceed that. You have to finish the game on a fixed budget. The limited crowdfunded beta situation would also like allow for like the scarcity hype, you know? You'd still be able to give out copies of your game to streamers or whatever, and that could like build hype during the production cycle. But most importantly, having this limit on early access copies would put a huge incentive on finishing the game. I'm not a developer, and I don't have a developer's perspective, so I would really appreciate if there's any developer that's making a game or possibly wants to do early access for their game, what you think about this. If you think that like, if there's something huge that I'm missing, a huge part that would really negatively affect you, I would love to hear about it. But for me, this seems like a really good middle ground. If you do both of those, if you one, change the semantics, change it from early access to crowdfunded beta, and put a set limit on it, I think that both of those things combined won't, of course, eliminate abandoned games, no way, but possibly could mitigate the problem, right? I don't know, let me know what you think. Ultimately, it boils down to this. Steam's hands-off approach has built a platform that many people really love, but it's also created an environment where there's gonna be a lot of buggy, unfinished, dead games. I'm not gonna act like I know better than they do, for sure, but maybe like a few tweaks here and there could make a big difference. And honestly, in an industry full of companies that seem to just like love to alienate their audience, it's really nice to be able to rely on Steam to kind of usually make the reasonable decision. Another company that just recently announced a surprisingly reasonable approach to game development is Obsidian. I just talked about that. If you haven't heard about it, you can watch this video here. My name is Terrence. I'm gonna keep playing games till I find the perfect one. Peace, love,